When I was in high school, I learned that my family was in possession of my great-grandmother Ruth Burkard's diary. She began writing it immediately after she learned that she was pregnant with her son Peter, my grandfather, in Germany in 1939. In the hope to learn more about my family and its history, I worked with the Amish and Mennonite Heritage Center in Holmes County, Ohio, to have the diary translated. It tells a harrowing story. World War II had just begun. Ruth's husband had been conscripted to be a doctor in the war, and she had been left alone to fend for herself. Wanting to know more about her story, I decided to interview my Opa, Peter Burkard, about his childhood, family, and the war. What follows is our conversation. I hope you find it as incredible as I did.
Go ahead and say your name and the year you were born.
Okay, Peter Burkard. I was born March 26, 1940.
And where were you born?
I was born as a refugee in Ottoboyan, which is down in Bavaria. Hitler started the war with Poland on September the 1st, 1939. My father was immediately drafted because he was a doctor, and so he had to go to a military hospital. My mother had to leave to go someplace away from her homeland there because I was close to the French border, and if the French were going to attack, then the battlefield would have been right there in our hometown. My mother was on the other side of the Rhine, didn't know where to go. And then she went to some nun who was related to my father into the convent because she needed a place to stay. The nun found out that she was pregnant, and so said, well, we can't have children in here, so she had to leave. So she went down to Ottoboyan, a place where my grandfather, her father, used to vacation. He was there at the hotel, which was across the street from a very famous, maybe the most famous Baroque basilica in Germany. And my mother then got a room in that hotel. And I think she then also mentions in the diary that the guy from the hotel, the owner, told her why she couldn't stay there forever. And then my mother wrote to Rudolf Hess, the deputy Führer. A couple of days later, a couple of guys showed up and said, Mrs. Burkhart's going to stay here as long as she wants. And then I was born, and we stayed there in Ottoboyan until the war with France came, and when France fell, then there was no longer any danger for our area to be involved in the war, and then we could go back home. The war was going on, but there wasn't too much bombing going on. The serious bombing happened after D-Day, so that when I was 4 years old, I remember at least 3 or 4 air raid warnings a day, and I was used to it, and I could understand that. I knew when to go, what each signals meant. I knew when to go into the shelter. I knew when to go out and play with my friends. My mother couldn't be with me all the time. She had a lot of things to do, such as standing in line for hours to get food. And then finally, in October, I think it was, of 44, we were hit. We started wandering around, and I think we moved in that year about 6 times, different places, because each place we went, all of a sudden the bombings came, we had to go someplace else. It was tough, but fortunately we had relatives in the area, and we could also always go to the relatives. So that's basically how it went until May of 45, when the Nazis surrendered. The situation then was the same as if in the United States, 1/3 of the dwellings had been destroyed, and at the same time, you had the influx of the entire populations of Mexico and Canada. The country was divided into 4 zones: US, British, French, and Russian. My mother, because she knew English, that was the thing that saved her. She was able to get a job then with the American military government as a translator. My future stepfather then hired her because he didn't know a word of German, he didn't know anything. He was the control officer of IG Farben, which at one time was the world's largest chemical company, U.S. zone. Because of the fact that my mother worked for the Americans, I had a lot of benefits which other kids did not have. There was always plenty of food for me. I had fairly decent shelter, but my father was gone in the war the whole time, cutting off arms and legs in the military hospitals. And then when he got home, his entire town was 86% destroyed. His family house and everything was destroyed. His practice was destroyed. So he had to rebuild it. My mother at the time had this job with the Americans, and she said, I'm not going to go there. I'm going to stay here with my child. That sort of wound up with a breakup of the marriage, of course. My parents were divorced, and there was joint custody. My mother and stepfather, or future stepfather, were going to get married. My stepfather hadn't been divorced yet. He had to go home to Nebraska, get all that straightened out. In the meantime, Canada was very open with immigration, but the United States was not. So I wound up 3 years in Canada, which I absolutely loved. I loved Canada. I started in May of the 4th grade. Knew some English, but not enough really to participate. And the people were so incredibly kind to me. And the teacher used to sit with me during recess and explain to me the things that were happening. She really participated and got me learning, and I responded to that very well. At the end of the 5th grade, I was up to speed with everybody. I really flourished there. Then in 54, came to the United States. That was more difficult. You know, my mother had remarried, and I had a stepfather, and we wound up in Nebraska.
What was your mother like, and like what are some early memories you have of your mother?
What was she like? Amazing person in many respects, but she had some problems. I think she was bipolar, and she went up, very high up, and then down, up and down. And I went through that with her, and it was not always easy. But then she had a rough life. During the war, the bomb shelters and the moving around, she wound up with serious kidney disease. I think she lost a function of about a third or half of each kidney. And she had ulcers and everything else. And the doctors told her that if she wanted to see me be about 10 years old, she had to change her life completely. And she became sort of a fanatic about nutrition. When she finally died at age 78, it wasn't because of her kidneys, it was because of her heart. She had a heart situation.
What did your family and like your mother think about Hitler?
She wrote that at first they were all pretty excited, particularly the youth. They had all kinds of activities for the young, camps, and a lot of sex, particularly the Nazis liked sex. Germany all of a sudden had pride. You know, there was a complete turnaround from the days before. They finally had some leadership, etc. This went on until November 9, 38, Kristallnacht, when out of their dining room, they could look onto the town. They saw all these people out there and people being chased, and there's gunfire, etc. My grandmother, my mother's mother, very compassionate woman, but she was tough, didn't cry, except that is one time when she cried bitterly because she saw what was happening to her country. All of a sudden she looked, and behind a bunch of houses there, all of a sudden she saw the smoke and the flames of the synagogue. I talked to her afterwards. She couldn't believe it. She said, "That's a house of God. How can you do such a thing? What has happened to our country?" The Nazis showed who they were openly to the whole country. So there was no longer any hiding, and they didn't do anything about it. When I was young, I never was that much aware of Hitler. Everybody was saying Heil Hitler, but I never understood that very well. My family was not pro-Hitler. I mean, they were not violently against him, but they just didn't like what was going on. And that's why my mother got the job with the Americans after the war. Her father was appointed a judge. They wouldn't have gotten those kind of positions had they been Nazis, a few years earlier. There were still some people who were very bad, who were bad Nazis after the war. I told you we lived in somebody else's house with their furniture, etc. Well, the guy who didn't have a job, the ex-Nazi, he was a doctor of chemistry at the local factory, and he explained to me what would happen when the Russians finally came. He would be liberated. People like my mother and me, who worked with the Americans and were friendly with the Americans, would wind up in concentration camps. So this is another reason why I was wet my bed every night, because of those kind of images. But a lot of people I thought were good people. So for me, it was always a difficulty in separating Nazi Germany from the regular Germans. I don't think that the nation as a whole participated in all the terrible atrocities, but they were not innocent entirely, that's for sure.
I guess you've talked a bit about this, but like, how did the war affect just like your daily life?
Well, my mother had sort of a nanny for me, and she was Alsatian, and she was only supposed to talk French to me. So I talked only French with her, and I said my prayers in French, etc., etc. And then as the war progressed, she had to go work at a factory. You couldn't have things like nannies anymore, which meant that my mother really had to do everything. The way it went is because there wasn't much traffic on the street. You just sent the kids out and they all played, and the older ones were supposed to watch for the younger ones. I did what I was told, and I knew all of the air raid sirens, but basically I was unsupervised. But I had no choice, nobody else had a choice. It's interesting to see what games kids play, because that tells a lot about what's going on in their minds. We were there in the sand. We were building fortresses, and then we came with rocks and tried to destroy them. We didn't have any toys and such. I had a little electric train which went down in the bombing. We started playing soccer, but we didn't have a ball. So tin cans is what we used. We sort of ran around. There's woods near where we lived. We'd gotten in a lot of trouble doing nasty things. We were not good kids at all. We were obsessed with the thought of death and destruction and whatnot. Yeah. The biggest danger was there was a lot of explosive ordnance lying around from the bombings. A little girl, a couple of stories above us, she picked up something or other. She lost an eye and a hand, I think, from in that explosion. Those kind of things happen very frequently. Of course, I had my own, if you will, treasure of munitions. I had an unexploded phosphorus bomb. Later on, I found a Panzerfaust, which was The German anti-tank weapon was sort of a cone which fit on a pipe. And they aimed and they shot that cone against the tank, which then exploded. And that cone was about like this. I had one of those in the way. There's one time when I was with another kid, and we found a box. Kids find everything. And that box had all kinds of rifle rounds, you know. And I said, oh, this is great. See this little dot here on the back? If you bang on that, it makes a noise.
Yeah.
Fortunately, none of them exploded.
Yeah.
Until they found it, and of course, took that away from us. After the war, my mother and I were relatives in the Rhineland in a winery. At that time, Hitler had declared there should be scorched earth. Nobody should be left alive. And we were right there. This was the battleground. Fortunately for us, Albert Speer countermanded Hitler's orders and came and ordered for an orderly surrender of my part of the country. But in the meantime, while this was happening, we were all 4 levels down in the winery where there's these huge, big barrels of wine all over. And amongst those, we put all the beddings. We figured everything above was going to be destroyed. The adults were up above during the day, but I was supposed to stay down there because they didn't want to have to chase me all over the place. So here I was among all those barrels of wine. I had nothing to do except drink wine. And there wasn't much activity, militarily speaking, but American reconnaissance planes, you know, came over the area to check things out. And that's a dangerous job, you know, to do that, to fly over any enemy country at treetop level. They would shoot at anything that moved. We'd be out there, and then we could hear them coming, and we'd wave at them.
Yeah.
And then we'd see the bullets coming, and there was a stone wall that we jumped over and hid behind. That was more fun. And that was sort of a game that we played until the adults figured out what was going on. They made sure we didn't do it anymore. Then a lot of the farms and wineries, they had prisoners of war, which were then assigned to the farm to help with the farm work. My uncle there, they had a Frenchman who they treated very, very well. He participated in all the meals. He had his own room. He was doing very well. But there's another family which mistreated their people badly, and they had about 5 or 6 of them. After the surrender, after the Americans were there, these guys got a hold of a rifle. They started going from house to house, plundering. For me, I was across the street from a building where a lot of Americans were building. And I used to go over there because Americans like kids. And we showed up, you know, give me food, please, you know, this kind of thing. And they all reached their pockets, and we came home like this with chewing gum and oranges and you name it, chocolate bars. One time I came back, and here was my whole family, everybody, lined up against the wall without shoes. There's a guy holding the rifle, and they caught me, and the guy with the rifle was going to crash the rifle butt over my head. I had an uncle there who was a Catholic priest. He had the French garment on, which French priests wore, with about 100 buttons down. He had gray hair and was very distinguished looking. He stepped forward and he said, "Halt!" And that's why he didn't crash on my head.
And how old were you at that time?
5.
Wow, okay.
I was 5. When I was 5, that was a tough year for me, because then I got bitten by the dog. The SS had highly trained dogs, big German shepherds. One of those dogs was running around, and an American captain who lived sort of next door to where I was living, he adopted this dog. Even though he himself couldn't handle the dog, He was afraid of the dog. Everybody was afraid of the dog. I was the only one that got along with the dog. And I would sometimes be outside with that dog, and boy, nobody would get near me, you know. The dog one time got away, and the cooks at the American quarters, they said, Lux was his name. Lux got away. Peter, go get him. Because everybody else was too afraid. Yeah. He was after a female in heat. He had his head stuck into this doghouse. And I didn't really treat him very well. I grabbed him by the collar and kicked him in the rear and said, come on, yeah. And he didn't know who I was. And he just reached out and with his fang caught me. And then he sort of relaxed. I think it just slid down and spread out my head. The lady who lived there with the doghouse, she saw that. She wrapped up my head in a towel, but they were afraid of the Americans and all that. They wouldn't take me any place. They just sent me home. So here I was with a split open head, walking home, crying. And then finally, they took me to a doctor, and then finally, I got some treatment. It was not a happy childhood, that's for sure.
How do you think, like, the way you grew up influenced your life as you got older and even beyond the war and even beyond Germany?
I wanted to really get away from home, if you will, in college. So I figured, all right, I went to the library and I found a catalog about Harvard. I said, geez, that's way over in Boston. That sounds like a good place. Nobody ever had gone to Harvard before from that town. Fortunately, with a lot of help from a lot of very kind people, I got in, When I first got moved into my new room at Harvard, I remember lying there on my bed. And finally I said, I'm home. Finally I'm home. I put away all of the horrors and fears and whatnot of my past. It didn't get rid of all of them. But anyway, I approached it. And I said, I don't really deserve to be here. I'm not good enough, but I'm gonna make it anyway, and I did. It stays with me. Like, for example, right now, if I watch TV right now, I start getting very emotional. I feel I know what those people are thinking as they have the Russians right there at the front door, ready to move in. I was there, and I know what it's like. For my kids and grandkids, I hope you never have war. It's the worst thing in the world. It is certainly hell on earth.
Opa and I talked for hours about his life, his mom's life, and the world that shaped Ruth's diary decades ago. It's easy to forget how recent these events actually are, and how our own lives and families have been shaped by this conflict. On the final page of her diary, Ruth writes a letter directly to her son, my Opa. I have written down here the first 2 years of your life. I have lived and experienced it with you. I always want to be a part of your life with you, my child. The first 2 years of your life will not always be so clear to me as this book is, but I will always be with you and understand you, for I am your mother, and a mother has to love, to forgive, and to understand. Well then, my child, walk on in life. If your strides become timid and tired quickly, then I want to help you and walk with you until mine are timid and tired, and yours are strong and valiant. God bless you in every way. He shall make you strong, healthy, to a man of action, honor, and with a golden, people-loving heart. May God let me keep you, for you are my only joy. Peace may come, a golden peace, because you have been born during a war and have not witnessed a day of peace. War was during your birth, war was in your cradle, and with your first steps. Your life shall be peaceful. Peace in your heart and peace in your homeland. This is all wished upon to you by your loving mother.